Lynn was a first-year student, newly moved to the city to study at a large university. Every afternoon after class, she would visit the university library to study and read. The library was vast and quiet, filled with towering bookshelves and the comforting scent of old paper. But there was something strange about this library that few people noticed. As night fell, everything seemed to grow darker, and the space itself felt like a refuge for things that couldn't be explained. Particularly, there was one forgotten corner of the library that no one dared to approach. Lynn didn't understand why, but she always felt drawn to this corner. One evening, as the lights in the library dimmed, she decided to venture into this hidden space. There, among the dusty bookshelves, she found an old, neglected cabinet. It was covered in dust and seemed to have been abandoned for years. Her eyes were drawn to a book on the highest shelf, its faded cover barely readable. With a faint outline of a ghostly figure on it, the title, The Dark Horizon, stood out, though it was almost unreadable. There was something about this book that called to her. Lynn didn't know what it was, but she couldn't resist. She reached up and pulled the book down from the shelf. As soon as her fingers made contact with the spine, she felt a chill run through her body, like an invisible force pulling her closer to it. Opening the book, Lynn began to read. The pages were thin and fragile, as though they were centuries old. The text on the first page was barely visible, written in a deep red ink as if freshly penned. "Whoever opens me shall never leave," the first line read. Lynn's breath caught in her throat and she hesitated, her eyes glued to the page. The words seemed to beckon her to pull her in deeper, but instead of closing the book, she kept reading. Suddenly there was a loud noise, startling her. The door of the library slammed shut with a force that seemed unnatural, and the atmosphere grew eerie and still. Lynn turned around quickly, but no one was there. The sensation was strange, as though something unseen was in the room with her, watching her every move. But rather than putting the book back, Lynn continued reading, almost as if the book itself was guiding her. "We will never leave. We will live forever in this darkness," the next line read. Lynn's heart raced. The chill in the air grew stronger, and she felt an unexplainable sense of dread. But her fingers remained firmly on the pages, unable to stop. The book felt alive in her hands, as if it was pulling her into another world, one where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred. Out of nowhere, a soft sound of footsteps echoed through the library. Lynn froze, glancing around in a panic, but she saw no one. The feeling of being watched grew more intense, and Lynn felt as though something was just beyond her sight, observing her every movement. She turned back to the book, and in that moment she realized that this wasn't just a book, it was something far more powerful. Something that knew her, understood her. Lynn's heart was pounding, but her fingers were locked in place, gripping the pages of the book with a strange sense of urgency. The dim light in the library flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer, almost as if they were reaching for her. The quiet whispers from the book grew louder, almost like a voice inside her head urging her to read on. "Don't stop now," the voice seemed to say, though no one had spoken aloud. "There's so much more to know." With trembling hands, she flipped to the next page, the yellowing paper cracking under her fingertips. The text seemed to blur in front of her eyes, but it was as if the words were being drawn out of the page, swirling into something more than just ink on paper. She felt her breath hitch as she read the next line. "Every soul who opens this book belongs to us. Your journey is just beginning." A shiver ran down Lynn's spine, but still she couldn't stop. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to close the book, but her body betrayed her. She turned the page, and the words on the next page were clearer, sharper, more real. It was as if the book was no longer just an object in her hands, but a living, breathing entity. Pulling her deeper into its grip, the text shifted, and Lynn gasped when she saw her own name written in the next paragraph. It was unmistakable. Lynn, the name on the page, wasn't written in a normal font. It was like the book had somehow known who she was. She felt an intense pull in her chest, a magnetic force that made her feel as though she was tethered to the book in ways she didn't understand. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to make sense of it. She looked around the library. But the room was empty. The usual hum of activity was gone. It was as if the entire library had ceased to exist, and the only thing that mattered now was the book and the words that seemed to be consuming her every thought. "Lynn," the book seemed to whisper once more, but this time the voice was louder, more distinct. It wasn't just inside her head anymore, it was around her, surrounding her. She felt her skin prickle as if the air itself had thickened. A cold gust of wind blew through the library, though all the windows were closed. The snow outside had intensified, falling in heavier flakes, but there was an unnatural stillness to it now, as if time itself had paused. Lynn stood frozen in place. Her thumb hovered over the next page, her heart racing, but something deep inside her told her not to turn it. She didn't know why, but she felt it, the sensation that something terrible would happen if she kept going. A voice, small but persistent, warned her that the world she had known was about to change. But the pull of the book was too strong, and before she could stop herself, she turned the page. The room seemed to darken even more. The shadows in the corners of the library stretched unnaturally long, like fingers trying to crawl across the floor. The air grew colder, and Lynn felt a tingling sensation on the back of her neck, as though someone was watching her, breathing down her spine. She turned to face the source of the unease, but saw nothing, yet she knew something was there. The words on the page in front of her began to shift and change, as if they were alive. The text morphed into an image of a library much like the one she was in, but different. This version of the library was dark, abandoned, and filled with eerie shadows, and in the center of it all stood a woman, her face obscured by a veil, her hand outstretched toward Lynn. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the depths of the library, low and guttural. "You shouldn't have opened it." Lynn gasped. Her breath catching in her throat, she dropped the book, stumbling back from it as the room seemed to close in on her. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were figures, looming over her, closing in. The coldness wrapped around her like an icy embrace. She stumbled to her feet, heart pounding, and tried to reach for her phone, but it slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. The woman in the vision on the page now stood before her in the same black veil, her face still hidden. Her hand outstretched toward Lynn. The air hummed with energy, with something ancient, powerful, and terrifying. And then, without warning, the lights in the library flickered violently before shutting off completely, plunging Lynn into utter darkness. A voice whispered in her ear, "Now you belong to us." Lynn's heart was racing as the darkness swallowed her whole. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes wide, struggling to adjust to the blackness that now surrounded her. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, groping for something, anything solid to cling to. The chill in the air was unbearable, an oppressive cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She tried to move, to run, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. Who's there?" Lynn whispered, her voice shaking, but the only sound she could hear was the eerie silence of the library, now amplified by her growing panic. A sudden chill swept through her like a gust of wind, and then she heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from behind. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears, but there was no one there. The darkness was so thick, it felt like it was closing in on her, pressing down on her chest. The book, the cursed book, was still on the floor, open to the page with the image of the veiled woman. Lynn felt an overwhelming urge to run, but something deep inside her told her she needed to face whatever had followed her here. She forced herself to bend down and pick up the book, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth pages. As she did, a strange warmth seemed to flood her body for a brief moment, almost as though the book was alive and feeding off her fear. With the book back in her hands, Lynn couldn't help but glance at the pages again. The woman in the image, she was closer now, her outstretched hand reaching toward Lynn. The veil that obscured her face was now fluttering as if a breeze was passing through the pages. Lynn's eyes widened in horror as she noticed something even more terrifying. The woman's hand in the image was no longer just a drawing. It was real, reaching out to her from the darkness. Lynn gasped and stumbled backward, dropping the book again. The sound of her heart thumping in her chest was deafening, her breathing shallow and erratic. The shadows in the corners of the library seemed to stretch and twist, forming eerie shapes that inched closer and closer to her. Each step they took felt like a nail being driven into her soul. She turned around in desperation, her hand trembling as she reached for the nearest lamp, desperate to light the way. But the light flickered once, twice, and then sputtered out completely, leaving her in complete darkness once more. And then she heard it, a voice, distant and hollow, but somehow directly in her ear. "You've opened the door, Lynn." She spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The room was still empty, save for the creeping shadows that seemed to be creeping closer. Her thoughts raced. She remembered the words from the book, "Whoever opens me shall never leave." Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Lynn froze, the skin on the back of her neck prickled with the unmistakable feeling of something behind her. Slowly, she turned around, expecting to find an apparition, a spirit, or even some trick of the light, but what she saw was worse. A figure, cloaked in black, stood in front of her, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes glowing with an eerie red light. The figure raised a bony finger to its lips as if urging her to stay silent. Lynn could only stare, paralyzed with fear. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, constricted as if an invisible force was choking her. The figure slowly extended its hand toward her, but before it could touch her, Lynn's body acted on its own. She shoved the figure away with all her strength, stumbling back and crashing into one of the bookshelves. The books tumbled down around her, but she didn't stop. She ran. Heart pounding in her chest, Lynn dashed toward the exit, her hands pushing against the heavy doors of the library. She could hear the footsteps of the figure following her, their rhythm slow but constant. Each step echoed in her mind, and every time she looked behind her, the shadows seemed to grow larger, darker, closer. She didn't stop, not until she reached the library's front doors. With a final surge of energy, Lynn pushed them open and stumbled out into the freezing cold of the night. The wind whipped against her face as snowflakes filled the air, but she didn't care. She kept running, faster and faster, until the library was nothing but a silhouette behind her. But as Lynn ran through the snow, she could feel it, the presence of something watching her. Something from the darkness that had followed her out, and in that moment she knew the curse wasn't over, it had only just begun. Lynn didn't stop running. The cold snow seemed to freeze her every step, but the fear that gripped her was far colder. She barely felt the sting of the wind against her skin as she stumbled through the streets, her eyes wild, her breath shallow. Behind her she could hear the sound of something following, a low, unnatural whisper that seemed to grow with each step she took. The shadows that had haunted the library were not behind her. They were following her, crawling over the ground like serpents. She couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness hadn't just stayed in the library. It had followed her, trailing her every move. Her pulse raced as she looked over her shoulder, half expecting to see the cloaked figure or the glowing red eyes, but there was nothing. The streets were empty save for the white blanket of snow and the dull glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Yet Lynn knew, she felt it. The figure from the library hadn't just been a trick of her imagination. It was real. And whatever force it represented wasn't finished with her yet. She found herself at the edge of the city, near a bridge. The wind howled as it swept over the frozen river, and the sound was deafening. Lynn's feet seemed to carry her toward the edge of the bridge, where the dark water churned below. She stood at the rail, staring out into the abyss, her mind a blur of terror and disbelief. How had she gotten here? What was happening to her? The phone in her pocket buzzed, the vibration feeling like a jolt of electricity against her skin. Lynn fumbled for it, her hands shaking. The screen lit up, showing a single message from an unknown number. The text read, "You can't run from us, Lynn, you belong to us now." Lynn's stomach churned. She quickly shoved the phone back into her pocket, but the words lingered in her mind, swirling in her thoughts like a vortex. Suddenly, she heard a voice from behind her, low and familiar. "You should have never opened that book." Lynn whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure was there again, standing in the shadows, a tall silhouette obscured by darkness. But now it was different. The figure wasn't cloaked in black. It had a face, pale and featureless, with hollow eyes staring directly at her. Before Lynn could react, the figure stepped forward, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the air. The figure's voice echoed in her mind again, but this time it wasn't just a voice, it was a command. "Come back, you are ours." Lynn backed up instinctively, her feet slipping on the icy surface of the bridge. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the blackness stretching forward, consuming everything in its path. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. She was trapped. In that moment, a flash of clarity hit her. She remembered the words from the book, "Whoever opens me shall never leave," and she understood. The book had not only cursed her. It had bound her soul to something darker, something ancient that existed beyond the pages of the book. It wasn't just the book she had opened, it was a door, and now she couldn't close it. The cold wind howled again, pulling her back from her thoughts. Lynn's feet slipped again, and before she could regain her balance, she felt herself falling toward the edge of the bridge. Panic surged through her as her body twisted in midair. She reached out, instinctively grasping for something to hold on to. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the railing, but it wasn't enough. She tumbled over the edge. The world spun as she plunged into the icy waters below. The coldness enveloped her, pulling her deeper, and for a moment everything went dark, but then something strange happened. The darkness didn't feel like the cold, suffocating embrace of death. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new. The coldness was replaced by an eerie warmth, unnatural but comforting. Lynn's eyes fluttered open and she found herself standing again. She was no longer in the river. She was standing in the middle of a vast, endless void. The snow was gone. The streets, the city, everything was gone. She wasn't alone. The shadows surrounded her and the figure was there again, its hollow eyes fixed on her. But this time it was speaking directly to her, not just through her mind, but aloud. "You cannot escape, Lynn," it said. "You are ours now, forever." Lynn opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came, and then a dark laugh echoed around her, filling the void. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but there was nowhere to go. Nothing left to do but wait for the next step in her twisted fate. Lynn stood frozen, her feet glued to the ground as the figure with its hollow eyes slowly advanced toward her. The void around her stretched endlessly. Dark and suffocating. She tried to scream, to run, to fight, anything, but her body refused to move. It was as if the darkness had a grip on her soul, holding her in place, keeping her trapped in this eerie, cold void. The figure, cloaked in shadows, spoke again, its voice reverberating through her mind, making her feel as though it was not just speaking to her, but inside her. "You opened the book, you opened the door to this realm, and now you are bound to it," it said, its voice cold, yet somehow inviting, as though it held the key to some terrible truth. There is no escape. Lynn tried to steady her breathing, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe this was happening. This couldn't be real. She had to wake up. But no matter how much she willed herself to wake up, nothing changed. She was trapped in the abyss, with only the haunting figure and the endless void surrounding her. "I don't belong here," Lynn whispered, her voice shaky. "Please let me go." The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You don't get to choose anymore, Lynn. You've already chosen when you opened the book. Now you're part of this world. You are part of us." The darkness around her seemed to respond to the figure's words. It twisted and shifted, the shadows growing and retreating as though the very air itself was alive, feeding off her fear. Lynn's mind raced. What could she do? How could she escape? Was there any way out of this nightmare? A sudden thought hit her like a thunderbolt. She remembered the words from the book, the ones that had seemed so innocent at first, but now carried a far darker meaning. "Whoever opens me shall never leave." But what if that wasn't true? What if there was a way to break the curse? The book had been her gateway to this place, but it was also the key that had bound her here. Maybe, just maybe, if she could find it again, if she could read the words aloud in reverse, the curse could be broken. The figure saw the change in her expression, and it took a step forward, its voice now louder, more forceful. "Don't waste your time, Lynn. There is no undoing what has been done. You are mine now." Lynn shook her head, the defiance inside her growing. "No. I will not give in," she thought. She couldn't accept this fate. She couldn't let the shadows win. The voice in her head, the one that had whispered, "You're ours now," was starting to lose its grip on her. She was not theirs to claim, not yet. With every ounce of strength, she pushed the fear aside and began to concentrate. She focused on the book, the cursed object, and the way it had felt in her hands. It was still with her. Even in this realm, the book's presence lingered, a dark imprint on her mind. "I will not be yours," Lynn whispered aloud, gathering every bit of power she could muster. "I will break free." A sudden gust of wind rushed around her and the darkness began to waver, flickering like a dying flame. The figure's eyes widened, and for the first time it seemed unsure. It stepped back as if afraid of something. Lynn closed her eyes tightly and reached into the depths of her mind. She thought of the book, the forbidden words it had written. She imagined the book in her hands. Words that had trapped her in this place, and then with a surge of determination, she spoke the words aloud. "I break the curse, I undo what I have done, I will leave." The air around her crackled with energy and the shadows recoiled. The figure, now trembling, took a step back, its form distorting as if it were losing its shape. "No," the figure hissed, its voice now laced with fear. "You cannot." But Lynn could feel the change. The curse was weakening. The shadows were retreating. The oppressive cold lifting. The book, whatever dark power it held, was losing its grip on her. She didn't stop. With every word, she felt herself pulling away from the darkness. The realm was starting to crack, the edges of the void beginning to dissolve into nothingness. The figure, now shrieking, tried to reach for her, but it was too late. The The shadows that had once been so powerful were fading. Lynn opened her eyes, and the void around her was gone. She was back. She was standing in the library once again, the book lying in front of her, closed and still. The darkness was gone, and the air was warm and familiar. She took a deep breath, her body trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. Her heart was still racing, but now it was full of something new, relief. The book that had threatened to consume her was now silent, its power broken. But Lynn knew that she hadn't truly escaped. The shadows may have retreated for now. But the curse was not gone forever. The book was still there, still waiting for the next person to open it. And Lynn, she had learned a lesson she would never forget. Some doors once opened should never be closed, and some stories once told should never be forgotten. Lynn stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She had expected to feel a sense of victory, but instead a quiet unease settled in her chest. The library around her seemed unchanged, familiar in all its dusty glory, but there was something different about it now. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the flickering fluorescent lights above cast strange shadows that seemed to twitch in the corners of her vision. The book was still there, lying innocently in front of her, its weathered cover now shut. She had thought the curse had been broken, that she had escaped its grasp, but a nagging feeling gnawed at her. As if the darkness had merely retreated into the shadows, waiting, biding its time. With trembling hands, Lynn reached down to pick up the book again. The moment her fingers brushed against its cover, a shock ran through her body, cold, electrifying, as though the book recognized her touch. She jerked her hand back, her skin tingling, but the book lay there, silent and still, its pages untouched. Lynn's mind raced as she stared at it, the figure, the voice. The whispers, everything about that cursed realm seemed too real, and yet she was back here. In the safety of the library, the place where it had all started. Was she truly free, or had the darkness merely retreated, waiting for her to make another mistake? Her eyes flickered to the entrance of the library, but no one was there. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound breaking the silence. She felt a deep sense of isolation, as if she were the only one left in the world. Suddenly, a thought flashed through her mind, a memory of the words the figure had spoken. "You belong to us now, forever." The words echoed in her mind like a warning. Lynn's breath quickened, and she felt the walls of the library pressing in on her again. She wasn't alone. Her gaze fell back to the book, and she felt an odd pull to it, like an invisible force drawing her in. The book wasn't just a physical object. It was something far more powerful. It was a doorway that had been closed but not sealed. The shadows were still there, lurking in the dark corners of the room, waiting to pounce. Without thinking, Lynn backed away from the book, her heart racing. She turned on her heel, determined to leave the library, but as she reached the door, a cold gust of wind slammed it shut. The sound of the door locking echoed in the empty space, and Lynn's blood ran cold. She turned around slowly, her eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing. The shadows, however, seemed deeper, darker than before. And then she heard it, the sound of pages turning. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The book was opening on its own. The spine creaked as it parted, and the same red-inked words began to appear on the pages, swirling into existence like a written curse. Lynn's feet were rooted to the spot as the words materialized before her eyes. "You cannot escape. The book chooses who it claims." Her hand trembled as it reached for her phone, but when she glanced at the screen, there was nothing but static. The connection was gone. No signal, no way to call for help. The book had followed her. The weight of those words hit Lynn like a ton of bricks. She had thought she could break free, but the darkness was relentless. It had waited, it had followed, and now it was claiming her again. Suddenly, the lights in the library flickered violently, and the temperature dropped drastically. The shadows grew longer, more sinister, as if the library itself was becoming the realm she had escaped from. A chill ran through Lynn's spine, and she realized she was no longer alone. The figure emerged from the shadows, its hollow eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. It stepped forward, its hand outstretched as it whispered, "Welcome back, Lynn. You have unfinished business here." Lynn's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. This was the moment she had feared. She was trapped again, but this time she wasn't just a victim, she was the key. The figure's voice echoed in the darkness, growing louder with each word. "You belong to us, Lynn, you always have." Her pulse quickened, and the terror she had pushed aside surged back to the forefront. She couldn't let the figure win, not again. She had to break the curse once and for all. But how? She had already tried to escape, and it hadn't worked. The darkness was too powerful, too persistent. The only way out was to face it head on. "Enough," Lynn shouted, her voice trembling with defiance. "I will not be a part of this. I will not belong to you." The figure paused, its head tilting as if considering her words. The room seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and thicker. "You have no choice," the figure replied, its voice chilling. "The book has chosen you. You are ours." In that moment, Lynn realized the truth. There was no running from this curse. There was no escape. She had opened the door, and now there was only one way to close it, by destroying the book, by destroying the source of this darkness once and for all. But could she do it? Could she summon the strength to end the nightmare that had already consumed her? Lynn's heart raced in her chest as the figure in front of her continued to loom in the darkness. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural red light, seemed to pierce into her very soul. The air around her grew heavy, thick with the weight of the curse that had followed her for so long. She had tried to escape, to break free, but the book had always found its way back to her. Now it was clear she was its prisoner. "You cannot win," the figure said, its voice a low hiss that reverberated through the cold, silent room. "You opened the door, and now you belong to us. There's no going back." Lynn swallowed hard, her throat dry. The words from the book echoed in her mind, "You belong to us forever." They had trapped her once, and now she was bound to them. But Lynn's determination flared inside her. She wasn't going to let this thing win, not again. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the fear creeping into her chest. "I will not belong to you. I will not let you control me anymore." The figure let out a dark laugh, the sound echoing like 100 voices in her mind. "You cannot break what is already broken." But Lynn wasn't listening. She had learned that it wasn't the book that held the power, it was the fear. The fear that had consumed her, the fear of the unknown, the fear of losing herself. She was stronger than this, stronger than the shadows that had tormented her. With a sudden surge of courage, Lynn reached into her bag and pulled out the same book that had cursed her. The pages were now blank, the ink fading as if the book itself were weakening. The room around her seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. "This ends now," she muttered under her breath, holding the book out in front of her. The shadows in the room seemed to recoil at the sight of it. The figure froze, its glowing eyes narrowing in what Lynn could only describe as panic. It stepped back, its form flickering as if it were losing its shape. "No," it shouted, its voice now desperate. "You cannot destroy it, you cannot destroy us." Lynn's hand shook as she opened the book, the pages still blank but pulsing with energy. The air grew thick with a powerful force, and Lynn felt the energy surge within her as she focused all her willpower on the book. "I will destroy you," Lynn said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I will break the curse, and I will be free." A blinding light erupted from the pages of the book, blinding Lynn and sending the figure shrieking backward into the shadows. The room around her seemed to twist and shudder, the air crackling with energy. The shadows that had surrounded her, that had haunted her every step, began to dissolve, flickering and vanishing like smoke. For a moment, Lynn felt weightless, as if the entire library was collapsing in on itself. The walls seemed to melt away, and the darkness that had suffocated her for so long began to fade. And then with a final flash, the book slammed shut. The room fell silent. Lynn stood in the middle of the library, her breath ragged but steady. The figure was gone. The shadows were gone. The curse, the book, was gone. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the library. The air was still, calm. The weight of the darkness was gone, leaving only the faint sound of her heartbeat. She was free. Lynn sank to her knees, tears filling her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't afraid anymore. The nightmare was over. But as she looked around at the empty shelves and the quiet halls, she knew that the book's power had not vanished forever. It had been broken for now. The curse might be gone, but she would never forget what she had learned. Some doors, once opened, should never be closed, and some stories never truly end.